This is your Armchair Detective, and today I'd like to tell you about the case of the anonymous letter. Chief Inspector Norman Old of Scotland Yard looked at the anonymous letter in his hand and read it for the third time. Dear sir, have you ever heard of a wife poisoning her husband? Look further into the death of Mr. Alfred Paul of Kirkby-on-Bayne. Why did he complain of his food tasting nasty and throw it to a neighbour's dog which has since died? In the name of the Lord, I beg you to look into this matter. It was signed, Fair Play. Inspector Old followed up this lead and found that a Dr. Manders had signed Alfred Paul's death certificate just the day before, giving the cause of death as an epileptic fit. Other discreet investigations revealed that a neighbour of the Pauls, a certain Mr. Horlicks, had been the owner of a wire-haired terrier which had died 2 nights ago after eating food complainingly thrown away by Paul. The dog's body was dug up. Next morning, the coroner stopped the funeral of Alfred Paul, and a certain examination was carried out at St. Mary's Hospital. 0.12 grains of arsenic were found in the dog, and 1.27 grains in the remains of the husband. Keeping this information to themselves, the police continued their inquiries. They learned that there'd been little domestic bliss at number 2 Crampton Street, where the Pauls had resided. They also learned that the dead husband had been over-friendly with another man's wife, while the extravagant Mrs. Paul had kept her husband up to his neck in debt with her wild spending on clothes and other frivolities. At this point, Inspector Old decided the time had come to pay a call on the widow Paul, who was now living with her gamekeeper father, a man known incidentally as an expert with poisons. Old introduced himself and immediately asked Mrs. Paul if she knew of her father's skill with poisons. Well, said the lady, I didn't know where he kept his poisons. I never at any time had any poison in the house and didn't know that my husband died of strychnine poisoning. Inspector Old seemed satisfied and next turned his attention to the gamekeeper, who admitted hating his son-in-law for making his daughter unhappy, but denied poisoning him. Well, you may think Inspector Old was at a dead end by now. But when he left the house, he took Mrs. Paul with him, charged with the murder of her husband. Now, why was Inspector Old so sure Mrs. Paul was the guilty party? The cause of Alfred Paul's death was known only to the police, yet Mrs. Paul stupidly gave herself away by saying she didn't know her husband had died from strychnine poisoning. This was the sort of absurd mistake a fiction writer would hesitate to use in a plot, and it put a noose round Gabriel Paul's neck at Hull Prison just 6 days before Christmas, 1934.